Good afternoon, everyone, and very welcome to this very exciting panel, which is on legal activism, with three very esteemed authors that we have with us. I have a feeling that a lot of you are going to be asking questions, so I'm going to leave some time at the end for you to engage with the authors. But we are going to first try and tease a few issues out from all three of them in relation to the theme that we've got. My name is Bronwyn Pithey. I am a lawyer with the Women's Legal Centre, which is an organisation which does strategic litigation advancing women's rights. And I'm very, very honoured and privileged to be joined by three authors. Of course, most of you know all three, I'm sure. That's why you're here and interested in hearing what they have to say. But I'm just going to introduce them very briefly because we really do only have an hour. And the first, well, I've actually got to in the, I've got in the middle. The first person I'm going to introduce is Joy Watson, who has written her first novel, The Other Me. She's a feminist researcher and writer, predominantly responding to public policy. She is also has extensive experience of issues kind of on the ground, as it were, and is a chair of a fantastic organisation called Women on Farms Project. She's busy finalising her PhD on rape and public policy and has previously edited a book with Amanda Goos called Nasty Women's Talk Back. And she's also, as many of you know, a regular contributor to the Daily Maverick. Then on my far left is Matthew Wilhelm-Solomon, who has written The Blinded City, who is a writer, teacher, educator. If I was actually going to say before I said this, if I actually spent time introducing all three of you, we'd be here the whole hour. So I'm really going to try and reduce it, and hopefully you can chat afterwards a little bit more. But he's a lecturer, he's done extensive research, and has written the most extraordinary book following the evictions, the concept of hijacks and dark buildings, etc., in the city of Johannesburg over the last more than 10 years, and I suspect that his research has gone back far before that. Has a PhD from Oxford and really has published extensively. And then Sean Davison, who is the author of The Price of Mercy, who is a professor in the Department of Biotechnology at UWC. He most probably doesn't need any more introduction. I think most of you know his background. But just technically, he was arrested and convicted for murder in New Zealand for assisting his terminally ill mother to die with dignity. In 2012, he founded the pro-euthanasia organization called Dignity SA, and his latest book really covers his arrest and legal process for assisting three men to die with dignity in the early years of the 2010s, but was then arrested for these offences in 2018 and 2019. So warm welcome to all three of you. I'm very, very, very happy to be here. I hope that I can, and this is a word that's going to come up quite a lot, I hope I can do justice to all three of these fantastic authors. And also just to say, I'm going to try and talk as little as possible, so I promise you I'm going to shut up soon. But really what's a little tricky about this topic is that it is really one aspect of all three of these books. And I know that a lot of you may be interested in other aspects of the books, but we're going to try and talk about the aspects of legal activism and the use of the law or non-use of the law and how useful the law can be in affecting social change. Personally, as a lawyer, I come from the public interest legal sector, which really looks at the advancing of rights and constitutional issues. And there are plenty of times where we see advances in the law, but it doesn't change the lives of people. And in a nutshell, I'd like to just say that in terms of Joy's book, which is a novel, the character, and I'm going to ask Joy about that first, the character actually does not use the law, but Joy has extensive knowledge and experience of the law in relation to violence against women and gender-based violence. Sean was obviously the victim, if one could put in inverted commas, around how the law does not protect the people that he was trying to assist, and was prosecuted, stroke persecuted, for that process of what the law was then in the way of. And then Matthew's work really covers a lot of aspects of using the law positively to protect people and to effect some kind of change and real victories through the issues of land and housing in Johannesburg. And for people who live in Cape Town, you know that there's obviously a lot of work around those issues being done by extraordinary organizations like Ndufunu Kwazi and Take Back the City in Cape Town that you may be more familiar with if you're not that familiar with what has happened in Johannesburg. So just very, very different ways of using the law and not using the law, where it's worked and where it hasn't. And then very briefly to say that what we're going to try and look at is that you have good laws, you have bad laws, and you have laws that simply don't make a difference to people's lives even if they're good. So I'm going to start off by just two very quick quotes. They're literally two sentences of each. The first one is by Neil Gaiman. It's a very familiar quote to most of you. And this is what he said: "The law is a blunt instrument. It is not a scalpel. It is a club." That's what I'd like you to just keep in mind. And the second one is by one of my most favorite feminists in the whole world, Audre Lorde, who said, "The master's tool will never dismantle the master's house." And I just thought those were two really useful quotes to look at how useful law can or can't be in dealing with the social issues that we're going to be discussing today. So, Joy, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to try and really keep quiet now. Joy, I'm going to start with you in terms of the book that you've written, which covers so many aspects and so many fascinating parts of a person's life, traveling through and through their suffering. And one of their aspects of suffering is clearly through violence that she experiences, yet she does not turn to the law. Would you like to talk a little bit about that, why you didn't have your character use the law in relation to gender-based violence and violence?
So it's ironic that you started me first, because I was saying that I started Sean's book about a week ago, and it was just deeply and captivating. And then last night I started Matthew's book. And Bronwyn and I know each other on the other side of sort of 20 years, but she is a very busy person and hasn't come out to play in a long time. So I'm just so delighted to be here with these three people that I sort of was hoping that I could slump in the chair and just listen to you all do your thing, but I guess that's not going to happen. Yeah, so in some ways, when I wrote this book, I wrote it wearing the hat of an activist, that this is the work that I care about, the issues in our society, violence, that you know, this is what I want to be a part of changing in our society. And so working with fiction was a different register to think and also in some ways, I guess, to make the story about violence against women more accessible and using a more sort of popular way of writing. And I think that I was also very much wanting to play with certain tropes. So one of the things that you will find in the book is that the character doesn't so much talk about the violence is not described really in any great detail. Yeah. There are allusions to it mostly, and the story centers around emotional and psychological violence, because I was very keen to make the point that emotional and psychological violence is as dehumanizing and detrimental as physical violence, and that is a political agenda, a point that I want to make. And the reason why my character doesn't access the law is because I also wanted to hold true to the reality of what we know from in doing this work, which is that most women who experience violence, and this is true for trans women, for LGBTQI groups, they don't report that violence. So the statistics that we see that we've just had released really mean very little at all. And the reason why they don't report is because of secondary victimization experienced when engaging with the criminal justice system. So I wanted to hold that true. Like for most women who experience violence, that is not the first thing that you're going to do, necessarily. It's, it's the very few who actually go and contend with that system. And as we know in doing this work, the vast majority, for example, of those who are raped and go and report it, that case never makes it to court. A very small percentage of those cases go to court. And as you would know, having been in the NPA, when the NPA, when they report on when the Department of Justice reports on its successes in terms of cases that went to court, they work with the number of cases that actually went to court instead of the vast majority that never made it there, which through their prosecutorial discretion, they just dumped and decided that they're not taking it further. So that was, it was a strategy.
Yeah, and I think that works it's a very, very poignant point, because so many people do say, well, why don't people just go to the police? Why don't they just engage with the criminal justice system? Yet we know exactly from those statistics, at the moment we have something like a 5.8% conviction rate in sexual offences in relation to the number of cases that are reported. So I wanted to then move on in terms of the different use of law. And Sean, if I could come to you, because really, I mean, reading your book, I think the word harrowing is for a lot of people. Actually, interestingly enough, when other people that I spoke to had read it, described it as harrowing. And maybe I should give you the opportunity to speak about what your experiences of law is, because you're almost experiencing both sides as someone who has been persecuted by the law, but also knowing that the law is something that could potentially assist and protect the people that you have been helping.
Thank you. The way the law can be changed is through the court or through Parliament. My story represents Parliament because the NPA representing the government went for me, a classic case of going for the man and not the ball. I'm here today, gone tomorrow, but the issue, the ball, is what the government should be addressing. And what we see in this country is that at every opportunity, the government has resisted a law change on euthanasia, every opportunity. And going for me was a classic example, wasting time, energy, resources off the police. Rather, they should be looking at law changes in other countries, what law would fit into our country, and engaging in the issue. They don't do it. And the alternative to changing the law, it's not going to happen through Parliament, it's to go through the court. Go to the High Court, Supreme Court of Appeal, and the Constitutional Court. And that is what we're doing now. But going back to Parliament, I won't have another go at the politicians. The first example of the government opposing it was when Nelson Mandela was president. He commissioned a law commission report on assisted dying. That report recommended Parliament discuss it and embrace it and change the law. Nelson Mandela commissioned the report and tabled it in Parliament in his last year as president, implying that he supported it. He had a dreadful death, as you know. In the 25-odd years since Mandela stepped down, the government, the politicians haven't touched it. It's still gathering dust in Parliament. They are not interested in it. And we've got that problem. And I'll talk about it maybe if I get another chance when I talk about the direction we're going to go through the court. To put the end of the story, if the court supports an assisted death and the government doesn't, you've got two laws in the one country that doesn't work. The court will tell the government to change the law, the Constitutional Court, and that is what happened in Canada.
Yeah, so thanks very much. Matthew, I'm going to come to you now because, I mean, your book covers obviously a long period of time, and apart from the extraordinary stories that you've brought to life, I think too many people who live outside of those areas, particularly middle class, predominantly white people, have absolutely no idea what's going on in places like the inner city, in the middle of Cape, at least in the middle of Johannesburg, and to a large extent here. But I think people need to read that book to understand that people do not choose to live in those circumstances, number one, which is maybe the most obvious thing to say, but also that their real life struggles and their communities. So maybe if you could just touch on briefly some of the positive aspects of how the law did make or has made a difference to those people who have struggled so hard in those circumstances, and I'm sorry, if you wouldn't mind, because just in case people haven't read the book, if you could maybe just explain the concept of hijacked or dark buildings, and then also your amazing link to the name of your book, The Blinded City, because I found that fascinating, how you drew that thread right through, if you don't mind. Thanks.
So I mean, the book started in 2010 when I first visited an unlawful occupation in inner city Johannesburg, and a space, as doing work with an article about Doctors Without Borders at the time, and they had a survey that found that 50 to 60,000 people in the city were living under conditions worse than international standards for refugee camps. And this is in the center of one of the wealthiest cities on the continent, and also near my family home. And so this was a space without electricity, without waste collection, one tap for several hundred people. And this was a mass phenomena, but in the media at the time, and this emerged in the early 2000s, you had this idea of building hijacking becoming a kind of popular narrative. And while there certainly were criminal syndicates who were involved in illicit rental takeover, what I started finding through my research is that the majority of residents in these spaces were precarious workers, unemployed, communities of the disabled who simply didn't have access to affordable accommodation. And so hijacking of a building isn't actually a criminal category. It's a category that's been promoted through the media and so on. And so you had, in essence, the criminalization of the poor, tens of thousands of the poor, as you have in Cape Town, and we see the situation continues, the criminalization of occupants at Sissigul and other spaces. But this narrative was not innocent, because the narrative legitimated a particular response to these spaces, which was often these highly militarized police raids, indiscriminate raiding of homes without warrants. And so this narrative, I think, was particularly pernicious, and it veiled a whole array of complex social and economic issues. And so that's the one element. Another element was that often the reliance by the state was a kind of state abandonment and relying on the state to evict, on the private sector just to evict and renovate, and the sort of celebration of private sector regeneration, which was often very violent and didn't cater for the lowest economic residents of the city. So the book actually starts, and I try to tell some of these major constitutional court cases around housing. I can't go into all the details here, but through the lenses of those involved in them. So one of the main cases that I open with, it was known as Blue Moonlight, which was residents in an old carpet factory in the inner city who were not, they were living in this carpet factory as a kind of community and were targeted by eviction, in fact an illegal attempt by the police to evict. And so that case went to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court found that the city of Johannesburg was legally obliged to provide what was called temporary emergency accommodation for those evicted, if it would render them homeless, even if it was a private sector developer. And that, it was a very major judgment for Johannesburg, but also the city. It also built on, I'm sure many of you know, the case of Irene Grootboom and the case in 2000, which established the principal framework. But what also struck me, and this is interesting in the Cape, is most or many of us know the name Grootboom, but there's very little written about Grootboom's life. I looked into it. No one, I think, that I know of maybe did a really extensive biography of Grootboom and so on. And so often those stories of the people involved in the cases are erased. And part of the work was to really trace, well, what is the relationship of law and life? And this complex relationship, because it also, you can have a judgment which is very good on paper, but it has unexpected consequences. So one of the stories that runs through the book is that, in fact, the judgment led to the splitting of families, including of one of the main individuals, Nomsel Ndladla, whose granddaughter was taken away from her, and she was the sole guardian as a result of the conditions of accommodation they were put into. And that led to another major case called Ndladla, which then established. But so it really, I think what we explore here and what is a theme throughout is even when there are successes, that the law is never enough. The law has to kind of live, and it has to be internalized, and it has to, have relationships with social movements, and I think that's also a key theme in the book, both the successes but also the limitations of a purely litigative approach towards social justice.
Yeah.
Can I just say something about that just occurred to me listening to both Sean and Matthew, that and as you were talking, I was thinking a lot about Trevor Ngwani's work on Amakomiti, which describes the strategy behind how informal settlements are created, and where there's a plan to move in, and knowing that there will be a law enforcement response and you'll be evicted. And so the strategy entails you use your worst materials because you know they're going to be taken down, and you keep going back and you keep going back, and by the time you're going back for the millionth time, that's when you take your nice stuff and you erect, because by then the authorities are just going to get into a negotiation around, okay, we'll allow this to be, but these are the conditions, you can't let other people in. And when Sean was talking about how he became the focus rather than the issue, it just occurred to me that what we're thinking about and talking about here today and talking about legal activism is located within a broader discussion of engagement with the state.
Yeah.
And all the pitfalls, and I mean, you and I know, for example, the years of engaging with Parliament on what we think is needed in law reform, in enhanced service delivery, for changing the systemic response to gender-based violence. And if we analyze those submissions to Parliament over a 20-year period, pretty much none of that has changed. Yeah. And then we'll have calls for more public hearings and more submissions, and it's much of the same way. So what it got me thinking about is this concept developed by Leila Kasim, and she talks about that in engaging with the state for social change, that she sort of describes three moments. The one is a listening moment where the state listens, sort of, but doesn't hear, and just does it. It's not really hearing. And the second are listening moments where the state actually listens and engages, but there's one-sided action, it does its own thing. And then there are the rare moments of consultation moments where there's a two-way engagement and a meeting of minds, and that's the moment, the nexus within which change can happen. And so what we have to understand is what makes those moments, those consultation moments possible. But mostly there's a path dependency. The state does what it does in the same way because it's used to doing it, even when to do it a different way would be more efficient and better. It's very hard to break that path dependency. So there are moments where a break from path dependency can happen, but they're few and far between. And what we have to understand is what are the enabling factors that create for the opportunity for consultation moments where the change is possible.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for that. I mean, one of the things I was going to just follow up from something that you said, Matthew, and I think it links a little bit to what Joy is talking about, is that the irony, when I read your book, I mean, in a way, I mean, and by no means undermining, please, in terms of the apartheid states, but it was almost like reading forced removal type behavior from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s in the apartheid era, And this kind of feeling of, but haven't we changed? Or don't we have a new dispensation? And then the other really striking thing that I thought that you brought out brilliantly in the book is that you have vulnerable groups and marginalized groups together that effectively, in terms of survival, have to turn on each other. And so you have people that are pitted against each other, the poor against the poor, all fighting for survival within a system that, in terms of the legislation around land and housing, we actually probably have more progressive legislation, but again, it's around enforcement, which is highly problematic. And I thought that those kind of human stories were amazing. But then linking again with what Sean was saying is that playing the person and not the ball, is that where do we actually start affecting that change? And the frustration with Parliament is that I think a lot of the time that a lot of us, unfortunately, have abandoned the possibility of change through Parliament, and that we are actually now using the courts. So my question to you is, Sean, do we trust the courts?
Yeah, we trust the court. They interpret the law and stick to the law. But they have the opportunity to challenge the law if they don't see it as a good law, as has happened in many countries that have changed the law. The first case in South Africa was Robin Strantham Ford, you might have heard about in 2015. He was an advocate of the court, but terminally ill with cancer, dreadfully ill, having a horrible death, went to the High Court asking for an immediate and urgent assisted death, and the judge granted it, setting a precedent. He died the day of the ruling, so he didn't have the assisted death, but the ruling stood. It had been made by the court. A government, what can they do now? If anybody else went to the court, they could have an assisted death. They challenged the ruling in the Supreme Court of Appeal, and it was overturned. Back to the beginning. Dignity SA, the organisation I represent, made a big mistake. We didn't go to the Constitutional Court. We should have done that immediately, and probably would have won. We have what is considered one of the most liberal constitutions in the world, where dignity and life is a theme. Dying is part of your life. And we believe when we get to the Constitutional Court, we will win and the law will change and Parliament will be instructed to change the law.
Yeah. And I think that that's very often, certainly in the area that I work in terms of violence against women and gender-based violence, is that has been the route that a lot of people have gone, is that even though we do in this country have very progressive laws around violence and women, gender-based violence, very often the implementation is one of the most problematic aspects, and we've had to go to court in order to do enforcement. And that's what I was going to, just to come back to you again, Matthew, if you could talk a little bit about enforcement and the, I mean, what I find without stating, well, maybe I am stating the absolute obvious, is that law enforcement, particularly the police, if we can focus on the police a little bit, law enforcement in terms of the people that you were working with were absolutely absent when there were people whose lives were literally in danger. I know that you wove a lot of issues around women and violence against women and gender-based violence into your book as well, which I thought was also fascinating, really understanding that people living in those circumstances were subjected to violence on many levels, but the absolute absence and disinterest of police when it came to assisting these people in their everyday lives, yet they were very present when it came to things like the raids under Mashaba and the raids and the so-called evictions and a lot of the time even when they didn't have court orders.
Well, I think a sustained critique throughout the book is the critique of this very militaristic raid-style approach to policing, which in fact, as I discuss in the book, has the raiding of individual homes without a warrant has now been declared unconstitutional. It still is happening all the time,
Exactly.
but you know, this is... Yes. But this is the Constitutional Court. These raids were without evidence, without efficacy, and really targeted at displacing, you know. And this is not something new. It was ratcheted up under Mashaba, but virtually all political parties, and the ANC was doing the same thing, is using it as what was essentially a housing crisis as to target subsequent military police raids, which were counterproductive because they broke trust with communities, they kicked mothers and children onto the street, they reinforced all sorts of trauma. And what I think is particularly pernicious is when the gender-based rights language is used to legitimate, oh, we have to respond because there's rape, there's sexual violence. They do absolutely nothing to protect women, but in fact, a lot of women are targeted in them. They do nothing to really, and so I think while there's obviously that critique and there's a wider conversation around policing, often people don't think, well, in fact, decent housing is a security intervention. Decent housing, sanitation is gender-based rights intervention if women don't have to walk in the dark or go to the, and so there's a whole array of socioeconomic interventions, which I think would be more effective than just thinking through policing. And also, I think this links to Joy's work, the issue, I think, that many South Africans, but particularly those in precarious communities, are living with very deep domains of trauma, including the men who are perpetuating the violence. So to what extent do we invest in systems that, in fact, re-trigger and reproduce trauma and violence rather than actually deal with it? And I think it came a lot in Sean's book about the kind of desensitization of law actually to suffering and trauma and that kind of gap. And I don't have the answers, but I think it's a question that we really need to think about, the relation of also law to healing and to a sensitivity to suffering and trauma.
I mean, actually, I'd like to ask you about that, Sean, if you're comfortable with speaking about it, because I was quite blown away by how aggressive the police, particularly, were in relation to you. What do you think that was about? I mean, was that deeply personalized? Was it about the issue? Why do you think that they... And also the way that they kind of hung things over your head for so long, with a kind of like insidious threat a lot of the time around the pending cases that they hadn't officially charged you with yet.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer. The bottom line is the police are told to do a job and they do it. So I hold no grudge against the police. That's what they do. And they probably don't think about the issue or the person. They do their job, often very physically. An underlying question is, why did they wait 5 years to arrest me? I helped Dr. Heinrich Böll to die in 2013. Due to circumstances, I had to admit it at the time, because I was about to be arrested then. And then nothing happened for 5 years. Why did they wait when they had all the evidence? They had a complaint from a member of the public. There's nothing more they needed to add to the case. Why wait 5 years? And I can't answer that question, except to think it is a sinister answer. They arrested me prior to another case going before the High Court. We had Robin Strantham Ford, then we had Dieter Haak going to the High Court in the end of 2018. Arresting me discredited the organisation and the issue. Other than that, I can't think why they waited 5 years. Keeping it hanging over me, yeah, and then kept on adding on more charges.
Yeah, because, I mean, and maybe it does maybe speak to that without sounding too much like a conspiracy theorist. That there are clearly very strong people who have very vested interest in euthanasia not being made legal. And I guess my question to you would be, when maybe my question was a little too blunt, whether do we trust the courts? I think a lot of us do have faith, absolute faith in the Constitution and the implementation correctly by the Constitutional Court of the Constitution. But there is definitely going to be a lot of opposition to this, because the thing is that Parliament has sat on it for so long, and I guess a lot of us are asking, well, why? What is the pushback against this when, like Matthew raises, the trauma that is connected with people who are suffering and wanting to die and wanting to be assisted to die?
I know we haven't got much time, but I'll make one final comment before going to them. The government is bitterly opposed to a law change. Bitterly opposed. And they have reasons I can go into if we have time. But people will argue that if the government is opposed to it, the Constitutional Court will never approve it. But they are independent. So we have to have faith in our Constitution and our Constitutional Court. And a final comment, the question might come up, I got a plea bargain for a crime that faced a life sentence in prison. People are saying, well, the government is going soft on euthanasia. Surely, if they are tough on euthanasia, I'd be in jail. The reason I got a three-year house arrest sentence is because the government was scared if I went to court, Desmond Tutu would have been arrested as an accomplice to murder. And in our country, if you are an accomplice to a crime, you face the same penalty as the perpetrator. They didn't know that when they arrested me. It came up as evidence was gathered that he was very closely associated with one of the murders that I was charged with. And if I'd gone to court, that evidence had to be tabled. They couldn't hide it once they had the evidence. And when that was tabled, the public would have been demanding that Archbishop Tutu be arrested. And if he went to court, he would have happily gone to court. I know, he would have been very proud to defend the person that had an assisted death and the issue he believed in. He would have gone to court head held high. But it would have damaged the government in trying to defend the law. People would have seen the terrible life and death that man was having. They would have been sympathetic to the views of Desmond Tutu. The law would have changed. Give me a plea bargain, ban me from talking to the media for 3 years, the issue goes away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I guess the next question I'd like to ask you before I get back to Joy and Matthew is, you know, there are obviously different strategies going forward around assisted dying. One is when you assisted was how the police got up to you and you stand up and you challenge it and you take this further. Or alternatively, the person who is looking for assistance in dying. And I understand that that's the strategy that has been decided upon.
Yeah. We're going through the court now. We have a man with motor neuron disease, the same as Joost van der Westerhuizen, people are familiar with, the rugby player. He has presented his evidence in the High Court. We're now waiting for the government to present the evidence against him. And if we lose, we'll go to the Supreme Court of Appeal. If we lose, we're going to the Constitutional Court. And we will win, I'm confident. And a comment on his evidence, Dieter Haak, who gave the evidence, when he was questioned by the government lawyer, I saw it was on Zoom, the government lawyer said, have you read the Peaceful Pill Handbook? It tells you how to end your own life. And Dieter said, yes, I've read it. And the government lawyer said, why don't you commit suicide? Why come to the court to change the law? It's on video, we've got it. Sure, he can commit suicide. It can go wrong, it can go horribly wrong. And that's why we want to change the law. So you have a guaranteed peaceful death. That was a government lawyer, his name, Advocate D. Olivia. I've got his name. He's been named and shamed. Yeah.
Indeed. Joy, I'd like to come back to you and really maybe try and unpack a little bit more of the aspects of the violence related to your book, obviously, in terms of the psychological, emotional violence, but obviously physical violence as well, and how that, I think, links again to some of the issues that Matthew was talking about around trauma, and what the profound and long-term and deep effects of that are, and I guess, is there a light at the end of the tunnel in terms of understanding that the way that our law is doing that? And then again, the gatekeepers, the police, the criminal justice system, the civil justice system, etc.
You know, when Matthew was talking about those forced evictions and the brutality with which they are carried out, it reminded me of, you know, the lived realities of the women who women on farms work with.
Yeah.
And in that context, Women on Farms has had to step in to assist women when they are elderly, who have spent their entire lives in tenure on farms, working on a farm, and they, as part of the remuneration package, are housed on the farm. And once you get old and you are unable to work, there's this brutal, consistent eviction of people who have dedicated their lives to working on a farm, and they are, with brutality, put out of their homes. And you're talking now about people who are particularly socially vulnerable. And so the work of an organization like Women on Farms is to challenge and question. And, linking that to trauma. I mean, can you imagine being that age and this is your home and now you are displaced and you don't have youth on your side? In thinking about these issues and even some of the stuff that you were saying, Sean, I think that often we locate these debates in the horror of the law enforcement approach and the police's approach. We try and think about the opportunity of engaging with reform through the criminal justice system, through the courts. But I think that what should be foremost on our minds is that these things happen within a social context where there are structural drivers of this trauma. So the kind of housing issue, the kind of dying in a traumatic way exists within a social context where there are structural drivers. And I don't see how when we're in this country, we talk about dealing with housing and creating homes, how realistically that debate is always located within the framework of a neoliberal capitalist framework. And that's not going to solve it. We talk about this thing within the government discourse of economic growth. Economic growth, and let's not even go there, but I just want to pull my hair out every time I hear that word. What about the care economy?
Yeah.
What about how we take care of each other? And I don't think that we have a coordinated set of government interventions to holistically deal with the structural drivers of poverty that results in these issues. We talk economic growth, we don't talk poverty alleviation, and the bulk of our people live in poverty. What are the social drivers that allow for people to die in trauma, to live in trauma? And why is it that we are locked into these macro systems of thinking around the economy, around how we function as a society? I mean, one of the things that makes me want to pull my skin off is the ongoing use of the term, government's use of the term social cohesion. We have to build a socially, what the actual fuck is that? And I don't want to be socially cohesive.
Yeah.
So I think that, in many ways, we are a traumatized country, we are traumatized communities. We carry historical trauma for those of us who are black. And there is no place to put this trauma. And we really are, in a system where there is no enlightened thinking as to how to begin to engage with this.
Yeah, and I think, thanks so much for that, Joy. It's brilliant, yeah, really. Like, absolutely spot on, and I hope this leads nicely into a question that I was going to ask Matthew, is that, like you said, some of the court victories from the people that you were working with and doing research with and gathering their stories and really putting it out there what their lives are have been phenomenal. Those victories are incredible. The precedents that have been set through those cases and the courage of those people to pursue them. I guess my question is, has it changed a lot of those people's lives in the reality? I mean, you spoke about the unforeseen consequences, particularly with one of your main characters is just wonderful, and her life is extraordinary. But I guess my question is, we have these incredibly powerful judgments, but has it changed people's lives? And do we persist on that route? Not as an either-or, but do we persist with legal solutions?
So I think, and I'd also afterwards just like to pick up on something Joy said, but I think they do, I mean, there certainly has been a great protection against eviction, for instance, so, but nonetheless, has it resolved the issue? No, because what's happened now is you have people like Normstead and Ladler who go into temporary emergency accommodation sites, which are to protect against homelessness, but if there's no housing for them, they've remained. Ladler's been there for 10 years now. Others have been there for 15 years. I think there's sites around Cape Town also where people have been in temporary emergency. So temporary emergency accommodation has become de facto permanent accommodation. And that's just a reality because you can't use the same laws to evict people from those, you know, so it's not as, it's protected against homelessness in the sense that people aren't on the street, but it hasn't really, it's deferred the issue rather than resolved the issue. And you can't resolve the issue just through litigation while the housing isn't there. So I think that's what I'm speaking about. You know, I think law has power and it can be used as a weapon, but often the impacts of those judgments are complex and the law itself can't resolve. But I also wanted to pick up on something, you know, Joy is saying, just about the kind of structures of trauma, because, you know, when we speak about policing, I mean, police are also extremely traumatized in their work. You know, when we speak about, for instance, I write about the deportation system and migrants going to Lindela where there were extraordinary abuses and it was linked to Bosasa and state capture. But I also had sources who were the guards themselves who worked at Lindela, who were South African, and they were extraordinarily traumatized and brutalized by the process because they weren't trained as detention officers, they were paid below their grade of, you know, and they were like, we went into the space where there were riots with no training, inadequate, and so they were violent, but they were violent because they were put into a space that itself was very brutalizing. And the deportation, I mean, we haven't really discussed the issue of migration, but also this thing of, oh, we can deal with these issues through you know, deportation. Well, a part of I didn't answer your question about the title, but part of the blinded city is the blindedness to history. Yes. Well, let's look back. Let's look what's happened. We had Lindela, where the cash from Lindela was being used in Bosasa's vaults to pay bribes, you know. Completely, even if your logic is to get people out, completely ineffective. Anyone can come straight back, but you set up a system which is extraordinarily brutal, also to South Africans, not just migrants, which doesn't work by its own logic, but opens up enormous space for rent-seeking, corruption, and a whole array. And so, you know, it connects to like is this a valuable use of resources? You know, the fact in Sean's book, he had, you know, that scene which is absurd, 3 people chasing you while you're buying a toy for your kid, you know, I mean, is this a valuable use of public resources, you know?
Well, I think that's the whole thing is that, you know, when you really need the police, they're not around, but when you don't need them, there are a lot of them around, a lot of the time. Okay, I've just looking at the time now, I'm going to really open it up to some questions. We've got just under 15 minutes, and I'm sure there are quite a few questions. If we can try and keep the question shortish and just tell me who you direct, or tell us who you direct the question to. Just raise your hands. I cannot believe that people do not have burning questions. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead. Yes. Oh wait, there's a mic coming towards you. There we go. Thanks very much.
This is a question for Matthew. I think we also have the misconception that those hijacked buildings, it's largely illegal immigrants occupying that, and that's hence the force and the forced removal. Is that not the case?
It's clearly not the case. I mean, there's, you know, a large number of occupants are South Africans. And if you look at the major cases, one can look at the legal record, Blue Moonlight and so on, the majority of occupants are South Africans. And that's from I can't give you statistics because there's no reliable statistics, but clearly these populations of both South Africans and foreign nationals, and the same here in, you know, the occupations here, they're a mixture. And I think this leads to the question around dispossession, is what has been framed often as a criminal migrant issue is essentially a continuation of historical patterns of the displacement of working class black populations from inner city areas. And you know, I mean, we have the history right where we are, but these processes are very much still continuing.
I mean, that of course is, I was going to say that earlier on, is that we're sitting in an area exactly which has a very similar history in terms of District 6. And I mean, one other aspect which is fascinating in your book, which we haven't been able to touch on, is the xenophobia that is very, very linked, I think, to your question, is that it's so much easier and obviously has been used politically, that it's foreigners, and that lands up then splitting those communities. And a lot of those communities actually were quite not cohesive, but but a lot of those communities were real in the sense that they were dependent on each other in a lot of ways for survival, and the way that the xenophobia played out was to actually put people against each other. There was a question just behind. Yeah, just get the. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. So for any of the panelists, just two disturbing things that I'm following on from the last point. The scapegoating of migrants. Speaking to a Zimbabwean who's been working in a gardening service for 18 years, that what Home Affairs officials are doing to drive Western Cape at the moment is raiding services and nurseries to try and basically force foreigners out, because there's a month-end ending of permits that's been announced, which may or may not be extended. Just like to comment on that Home Affairs officials suddenly find the capacity to raid nurseries and garden services, but they don't have the capacity to deal with year-long backlogs in applications. And quickly, a second disturbing element in Joburg and elsewhere is the allowing of sort of force vigilante groups like Operation Dudula to function and to commit violence against communities, and where the police, the law in this case, turns a eye to that. Use people like Dudula to do the dirty work, if I can put it that way. Any comments on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, there's mass scapegoating. Without, there's a rhetoric of migrants just using social services and so on. Often it's scapegoating of, there's not the evidence to justify that the health system. I mean, the estimate is 8% of the population is foreign nationals. So, I mean, of course, the statistics are problematic, but that's not collapsing our health system, And so there's a huge scapegoating. But what people don't speak about is the enormous resources that go into migration policing, that go into corrupt centers, that go into all of this. And just, I mean, we can go on and on about this, but but Dudula, I mean, this is happening like now, and I didn't discuss it in the book because it went beyond the end of the book, but I mean, there's no police protection. I have people calling me and they're saying, like, Dudula is here. It's no secret who they are. They put their names on the illegal eviction notices. People go to the police. There's no police protection. And so what's happening in places like Orange Grove and Johannesburg now is literally like, the communities are just gathering on their doorstep to stop Dudula doing what are essentially illegal evictions with absolutely no state or political protection. And then you have I'll leave it there because there's a lot to discuss.
Can I say something?
Yes, please go
ahead. So I was part of an initiative a couple of years ago where we went into all of the provinces to hear people's stories about their lived realities so many years into democracy. And these were the poorest of the poor and the most vulnerably and socially marginalized people in our society coming to tell their stories, like grandmothers who have seen their grandchildren shot in front of them, people struggling to put food on the table. I remember one young boy in particular who had said, I was told to get an education, to get my matric, and then I can get a job. I've done that. There are no jobs. I'm now working for a gang. Please, just want to get out. Like, I just want a job. And what I noticed as we were going around having these conversations, that in the horror of this sort of structural inequality and poverty, that how people were telling their stories was framed in a group discourse. So when they talked about the issues, they would other groups, and you just saw this unfold like around sort of cultural and ethnic and race lines. And what really struck me then was that in a context of the scarcity of resources and people struggling, what starts to happen is that you congregate around your group identity in the struggle to access resources. So it's fueling intercultural, intergroup intolerance, hatred, and just, I guess the reason why I'm saying this is that because recently a study has found the vast majority of South Africans across race, gender, and class show hostility towards foreign nationals in this country. And I think that is something that is dangerous and ugly, and it exposes everything that is not nice about South Africans. And that, in fact, we come from a nation of people who needed to go to other countries and seek refuge. Yeah. So it's something that really is kind of close to my heart.
no, very, very much so. Thank you, Joy. Yes, go ahead. Sorry, can you just wait for the mic? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a question for Sean, and it's about how you make the argument about the right to a dignified death in a country which, with so many people, rely on a notion of fate that is God-given. So what is the relationship between a very strong history of missionization and faith and an argument about assisted death? How have you managed to make that argument in this particular context?
That's a good question.
Yeah, the religious argument comes up again and again. To me, it is not a religious issue. I don't think there's anything in the Bible about euthanasia. It's really an issue between an individual and their own conscience. The most important thing is that it is about kindness. The intention is about kindness. And I've spoken to religious groups, and often I find they're very open to the idea of a law change. They want it defined within their religion, though. That's why they want to talk about it in their church. They're not opposed to it. Particularly the Afrikaners have often been to their churches. They are very open-minded to it. The big problem is, in the country is that 85% of the population is African, and they follow African ancestral religions. And I respect all religions. But in their religion, to become an ancestor, which is your goal, you have to have a good death. And suicide is not a good death, or helping someone to die is also a crime that can prevent you becoming an ancestor. Here, the input of Desmond Tutu was crucial. He was a Christian archbishop and a follower of African ancestral religions. And he said he wanted an assisted death if he needed it. And when he described his death, he described his funeral in the context of an African ancestral death and funeral, trying to open up the debate to the African ancestral religion followers. And hopefully the government was listening. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the question. Is there a question over there?
Hi, I'm just interested in your opinion on the balance of power in the courts. Matthew, I don't know if you're familiar with the River Club case, for instance, but you can watch the cases unfold and you have a very clear sense of where justice lies. But you see basically amoral arguments from a corporate side, which are by definition amoral, but battling against a moral imperative. Do you have any sense that the courts have a sense of morality, or is it, do you have any hope in that?
Good.
I'm not familiar specifically with the case, but I'd also be interested on what the others say. But I think that that there's a complex relationship between law, ethics, and justice. And you can't reduce justice and ethics to the law, and this becomes complex because how does one regulate what is ethical outside of the law? For instance, an unlawful occupation may be ethical and just, but not legal. In the case of Sean, what you did was not legal, but it was ethical. But then you would also get guys like Tadulu saying, well, what we're doing is not legal, but is ethical. So we are serving the justice. So it becomes a very complex domain, and I don't think there is a resolution, but we have to accept that the domain of struggle around morality and justice also has to take place outside of a codified legal framework. But I'd be interested in your guys' opinions.
Exactly what you said.
I can add to that. We like to think our society is governed by morality, but when morality and the law collide, the law will win every time, and that certainly happened in my case.
I mean, I'd like to try to be a little more optimistic, if possible, because, I think historically, these debates have been going on, for thousands of years, the split between law and morality and sometimes the conflict between the two. And at the end of the day, we would really like law and morality to come together to achieve justice, I think, maybe quite a simplified, maybe I've simplified it slightly. But I do believe that morality must come through. It must be reflected in our laws. And whether we have faith in that, I think that is obviously playing out. I mean, you talk about the Riverside issues all around basically environmental and his kind of ancestral and historic rights. So, yeah, we've got time for one more question. Is there...
Sorry,
go ahead.
No, just that morality question is an interesting one in the conundrum of the decriminalisation of sex work, which we've been working on forever to get decriminalised.
Yeah.
But that morality debate continues to make some people think that there's a moral problem with this. And when actually many of us hold the view that it is the moral thing to do to decriminalise sex work.
Yeah, and I think exactly, without again stating the obvious, in terms of so many of our laws in the past, where the laws were immoral, yet the law was there and was enforcing in an immoral state. Apart from that obviousness. Okay, I was given such strict instructions, but I'm just going to break them quickly. Go ahead. Sorry, there's just one more there. Yeah. I'm sorry to do this. We're going to have to...
Sorry, just as a follow-on to this morality and the law question and which should prevail. I think perhaps this is the general question to all of you, is there not an argument to be made that morality in itself is highly subjective and contextual and has changed? So you might have sat in this room 20 years ago and the majority of the room might have thought that it was immoral to have a protection of sexual orientation in the Constitution. But now we sit where I would hope that the majority do not share that view. And so we also need to be careful about our own lens of what we deem to be moral, because that is highly subjective.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think that's a fantastic way to wrap it up. So thank you very much for doing that almost for me. That really, I'm sorry, we have to wrap up. Please, a reminder to all of you that all three of the books from these authors are on sale outside in that big area, which I think most of you came through. So first of all, thank you very much to all of you for attending. It was an absolute pleasure and privilege to be doing this. And thank you so much to the three of you. I'm sorry, I feel like we have not done any real justice to any of your books because but all I can say to all of you is go and read them, because then you'll really get the real depth of all of them. So thank you so much to all three of you.